guys, and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface, Lesson 11. We're back. Thanks for patiently waiting for me to get the Mastering V-Ray and Mastering Lighting lessons out of the way, and now that my time has been freed up again, I'm really excited to once again visit my favourite character, Iron Man. For a long time, I was obsessed with the designs created by Phil Saunders, and in my opinion, each and every Iron Man suit he's designed so far is a flawless example of sci-fi design. In fact, I love the design so much, you might consider this, insanely nerdy. I've even had Iron Man tattooed on my arm. It's hard to really say why I love the character so much, but when I originally created the Iron Man MK3 model, it helped to get my freelance career kick-started because shortly after creating it, Marvel got in touch with me to freelance for them on an upcoming film project. Now, it's been 6 years since then, and I still admire the designs more than any other character I've seen in my life. The artwork from Phil Saunders is, I'm speechless about it pretty much every time. It's always out of control and inspirational. Now, on top of the subject matter being extremely fun, it's also a perfect challenge for hard surface modelers to tackle, as there's a really awesome combination of curvy surfaces, industrial bevels, and high frequency detail. And it allows us to model a character in a similar way to a car project, but the biggest difference here is when modeling from film projects like this, it's often the case that you don't have access to high quality blueprints or even any blueprints at all, and therefore a high attention to proportion and detail is required. So for me personally, modeling Iron Man was a huge step up in skill from cars, and I hope by breaking down how I model a character like this, you start to push your own skill set to a new level too. I've seen a lot of people attempt to model Iron Man and fail miserably, and there's been even a few people from the course attempt it, and the biggest issue is never actually the topology or the cleanliness of the model, but in the misunderstanding of his proportion and curves. So my goal is to once again explain to you the key differences that I'm focusing on while modeling, repeating the same theory that has been taught in previous lessons, but most importantly, how I'm going to break down his proportions. A project like this is extremely hard to do with a single monitor at hand also. So once again, I can't stress enough how important having detailed reference on hand at all times is essential to the workflow. I personally have 3 monitors, and while modeling anything, I always utilize the other 2 for reference. If I had my own way, I'd probably have 6 monitors all filled with reference. And honestly, you can just never have too much. So whether or not you've got things printed on paper because you don't have other monitors, just do whatever you can to cover your desk or your screens with as much reference as possible. Now, unlike previous lessons, I'm going to leave it up to you this time to find your own reference for the project, and that means tracking down and setting up the blueprints from Phil Saunders and any reference material you want. I personally relied on the Sideshow toy images as well as the blueprints created by Phil Saunders and the film model created by Josh Herman at Legacy Effects. He's probably one of the best modelers in the history of film, and even though he's a Maya artist, his attention to detail and cleanliness in his topology is pretty much perfect for film projects. So I'm going to do things a little bit differently in 3ds Max. I'm going to try and do things at a lower resolution, but we'll jump right in and get started. So before you do, make sure to do your research because a project like this requires a certain level of passion. Alright guys, to get started, as usual, I'm going to create a plane. I'm just going to convert that to an editable poly, go to the pivot, and align that to the origin. And now obviously because the vertices aren't exactly on the origin, I've got to select those and center them. I'm going to add a symmetry modifier to the mesh and then go in and assign a gold shader I've just got set up here. You can just copy those settings. So obviously the model that Josh Herman created from Legacy Effects for the film was insanely detailed, and it's got a really solid wireframe structure that would be suited for something like the high-res films. However, because I've got a little bit less time to try and break this down, and it's less about modeling the helmet and more about trying to show you the different areas in which you can utilize my techniques to minimize the topology itself, I'm going to go in and make things a little bit less detailed. But with that being said, I'm still going to incorporate all the main features of the Iron Man mesh so that when we do go into the lighting course and render it, there'll be enough there to give it the sense that it's photoreal. So the first thing I'm going to do is, on a mesh like this, and it's a little bit hard to explain at this point because everything I've explained so far requires you to understand that on an edge like this, it's good to have the topology flowing in that direction. However, at this early stage, it's not ideal to go in and add that. What we're going to do is we're going to lay out the basic topology of the helmet itself, and then on the areas where we do need those wireframe edges, I can go in and shame for some edges that we set up a little bit later in the process. So to start out, I need to actually consider how dense I want the mesh to go, and that requires studying kind of the details that are required on a mesh like this. Now, even though the faceplate is fairly low res, and I got away with making the mesh extremely low res on my MK3 model, this one has a little bit more details in it. Down here where the chin kind of blends in to the faceplate, there's a couple of little curves and stuff that I need to incorporate. You can see here it's kind of, instead of on the MK3 where it's flat, now we've got a little bit more detail. There's a couple of small bevels that you can't really see from the wireframe at this point, but in this early lesson I'm just going to not worry about those so much and try and make sure that the topology I lay out is as low as it can go while still having the ability to go in later and add those little details like the bolts and chamfered edges on some of the smaller parts. So to get started, I'm just going to line this bottom right vertice somewhere in the middle of the faceplate and drag down. And then on this vertice, what I'm going to do is drag up. So what we're essentially doing is we're kind of branching off that topology in that area. And what I can do straight away is just drag out. Now I'm going to go in and cut a line on the center of the mesh. And you can see here where the faceplate kind of sticks up that we're going to need to go in and pull that up. And if we only have one vertice in the center here, it's going to add a much higher risk of pinching. So I know early on at this stage I'm going to go in and add a second edge loop in the center here, and when I do that I can just maybe even this out a little bit, and in fact I'll probably just go in and add one more. Now because we know that these vertices on the center line are locked on the origin, I can just grab these, scale them in and pull them in, and now you can see what I was talking about earlier is even though that topology doesn't flow, what we're going to do later on is go in and chamfer this edge, and when I go in and connect those vertices, you can see we're converting that into a edge flow that follows along the bevel. But for now I'm not going to worry about that because I'm just trying to block out the topology itself. So I'm going to grab the edge of the plate now and drag this back. I'm going to drag this up to the front, and I'm actually going to flip the mesh because now I want the edges on this left side to be showing from front on. I don't want to be seeing the back side of these edge loops. So you'll notice that at this early stage I'm just using Alt X to make sure that the mesh itself is thin, and now I'll just start getting into shaping this to the actual geometry itself. And these blueprints created by Phil Saunders are going to be a lot better than the ones we used in the first lesson or one of the first lessons on the Ferrari, where things didn't really line up. So you can trust a lot more because when you see Phil's work, you know, the guy's a genius when it comes to concepting, and he really has, you know, created, in my opinion, the perfect Iron Man suits. Just really early days, just lining things up. I'm just going to pull these down and keep a little bit of a flow happening from the outside mesh into here. it's going to help us a little bit later on when I go in and try and clean up this topology. I can pull this up. I'm just going to drag some edges up here. And you'll notice I don't really care so much at this early stage about making sure everything is perfectly clean and topologically correct, because I'm just trying to lay down the foundation. So one of the most important parts at this stage is understanding how wide you need to go on the mesh itself. So you can see at this early stage, we're not getting a proper curvature happening from the outside of the mesh. And as you go towards the edge here, these loops are kind of very, near flat. So I need to pull them out a bit more. And that can sometimes mean going up. You can see from this edge loop, we're going to pull down and create the bevel along this side of the face. So at this point I can go in, select the edge loop along here, or the edge ring, sorry. I'm just going to connect an edge loop in between it. And I'm going to do the same for down here. Every so often you'll notice I hit the C button, which, as you know by now, is the edge constraint toggle, so I can go in without changing the directionality of the sideways curve. I can go in and just kind of reshift some vertices non-destructively. And there is a little bit of roundness, even though you can see here it looks kind of flat. There's a tiny little bit of roundness that fades into that flat edge. So I'm just keeping that in mind. And I'm not just gonna, you can see as I make this totally flat, then we lose that roundness, but then it also makes it impossible to blend the curve that exists out here into that flat edge. So I'm gonna go in and add a smooth modifier to this, just to make it a little bit easier to see how the polygons are being distributed. I can just collapse that down. And you see little inconsistencies where the wireframe doesn't flow very nicely. So as usual, you can see most of the process is basically just having the patience to go in and just push vertices around until they're in the right spot. You know, there's not really much artistic input going in here. All I'm trying to do is for each row of edge loops and edge rings, I'm just trying to create like an even distribution of polygons. So if there's anything ever down here as like an exaggerated example, you can see that it just stops the flowing. So, you know, from this direction, I'm just trying to make that even. You know, from here, you can see I'm just trying to get it all fitting in. Every so often, you'll notice I just kind of go out from the perspective viewport just to take a look at how things are blending together. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to keep the amount of geometry even, I'm just going to go in and chamfer this. And you'll notice I still haven't put a turbo smooth on this because I just want to make sure that the distribution of polygons is as low as it can be and is kind of optimized as it can be. Now eventually I'm going to need to go in and add the little bolt that exists down here. So as usual, I just need to go in and make sure I have enough geometry for that. So I'm going to chamfer these two. And now we can go in later on and split the vertices a little bit further and add that over this edge loop that we're going to create in here. But I won't create that just yet, but we'll create that bolt around this kind of 8-sided point. You can see these vertices from above, they're just sticking out. So I can just kind of select those and start pulling them in. you can see when I've moved from the front on side, I've moved that vertice back into place. What's happened is these ones are popping out now around here. So I also need to keep these in line. And that will involve pulling these in so they're not bulging out like that. Or if they are bulging out, it's just a very subtle, you know, just very, very subtle. So at this point, I'm going to go in and add a turbo smooth on, and we can start kind of cleaning up some of these areas. You'll see that once I get this main front base plate out, it'll be much easier to go in and extend from it. I just need to make sure at this early stage that the roundness is, you know, consistent with the actual real model. Because a lot of the times, modeling an Ironman suit, in my opinion, is kind of like a rite of passage for a hard surface modeler, because it's got everything a really nice, clean, hard surface model requires, you know what I mean? You've got lots of small details on a very well, evenly distributed, you know, curvy surface. So the details aren't insane. It's not like a Transformers model where it's just outrageously detailed and you lose a lot of the shape. It's kind of just more like a very advanced car model. And the biggest mistake guys make is going in and adding details before they get this original base plate correct, and then everything else from that point is impossible to clean up, you know, because you've got, you know, one surface, two surfaces, three surfaces, you know. From here, there's like another one, and to go in and re-clean that a little bit later is just too difficult. So now you can see I'm just going to start playing with the curvature here, and you'll just notice when you go from these extreme angles, every so often you just see something that just doesn't look right. So I've just got to select it. You know, and just fix it up one by one. Every so often it's a good idea to just kind of move it in an extreme fashion. I'm just going to go in and add a second turbo smooth to the mesh. You see we're getting a little pinch there. That little pinch will go away when I add a chamfer to this edge. Just making tiny little adjustments here and there. And now I can go in and select this edge and add that chamfer I was talking about earlier. When I do that, I'm just going to pull it out a bit. You can see we're still getting that pinch. So this is where I can go in and actually select both of those vertices. And if I move this, eventually it's going to hit a point where there's minimal pinching. like so. Just going to go down the bottom here and same for this now. And there's a very subtle raise in this front area, so I'm just going to lift that up now. And then down here, I'm going to pull this in a little bit. So from underneath now, one of the problems I'm starting to notice is that the curvature we've got going here is looking a little bit lumpy. What I mean by that is you can see the front of the plate goes perfectly flat, and then from here it kind of starts fading off a little bit too quickly. So to fix that, I'm going to go in from underneath and add a slight curve to these points and pull them in a bit more. Now from here, this point isn't going flat like it was like this. We've got a bit more of a curvature and it's flowing more into the side of the plate. Just going to select these outside vertices and just rotate them up. I'm going to have to turn off sometimes angle snaps on, and just remember that when you have angle snap on, sometimes you lose some of that finer control. The reason I'm doing this is because I've noticed on the reference image that in this concept art, the plate probably goes out a little bit too far wide. You know, the angle's sitting a bit too much like that, and I've just got to correct that. So I'm just going to pull that in. Same goes for this piece. I can just pull this in like so. This bit is a little bit too high. You notice there's just a very slight dint in the center here. So I'm going to go from underneath and just very slightly correct that. Now these are a bit even. You can see this side is a little bit smaller than this side. So I'm just going to turn on edge snap, move those in. you can see what's happening here is now we've added that chamfer, you lose some of the, consistency on that edge. And to fix that, I'm just going in and it's all these subtle details that make up that perfectly smooth mesh that you're kind of looking for. If you don't go in and pay attention to little things like that, you're going to get little pinches. So I really can't stress enough the importance of trying to find those angles which show off the imperfections in the mesh. That's what it's all about, When you've got a mesh that's actually not so detailed but has a very consistent and clean curve to it, you're not going to be able to get away with it just kind of modeling from front and side on. That's how you end up with those really lopsided meshes that don't have the correct proportions. So on the front here, it's still just not rounding correctly. Just going to pull all these vertices out a little bit. I'm just going from above. It's probably a little bit surprising for a few of you just how much you need to push these vertices around until they're in the right place. But like I can't stress enough, it's just the most critical part of the model. Everything else is going to flow off this one set of edge loops. So you can see I've turned on edge constraint here. I'm just sliding that edge loop so we've got it flowing up into this next bit up the top here. And that means I'm also going to need to pull down on this area here. So I'm fairly confident now that the curvature is working well enough where, I can see it's not perfect, but what I'm going to do now is because sometimes you get a little bit caught up in trying to perfect something before you've got another frame of reference. So it's kind of trying to balance out at what point you continue on in the model. I mean, you can see here there's some weird shapes going on in terms of the curvature this way. So I'm just going to, just before I go in, I'm just going to fix that. You can see I need to pull this out. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend this side piece here. And to do that, I'm going to select the edge loop. I'm going to hold Shift and drag it down. And you can see what that does is it creates a kind of a little bit more of an even surface. So rather than going in and dragging out like this and then kind of positioning them, by using the scale feature and then dragging it out, you have the option to keep some of that consistency in how this curve flows into the outer side of the plate. So the first thing I'm going to do is, before adding in the edge loop on the inside, is go in and try and get it as close as I can to hitting this this plate here. Now I'm going to drag out this point. Once again, I'm going to scale that in and just move it into position. And now you can see we've got a little bit of a problem where this geometry is flowing here incorrectly. What I want it to do is have a smooth surface here and a hard edge along here. So I can simply redistribute that by connecting down here and then connecting up, and bam, you end up with that nice clean geometry. And if I show you that from now you can see that little pinch that was there. It's still there, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was. It's definitely going to be, at this point, a lot easier to adjust that than it was with the weird, triangle, a weird square coming off, causing that pinch down the bottom here. So as you can see from here now, I can push and pull out until this area here is nice and smooth. Now, as usual, at all points, I'm just constantly going in and refining some of these curves. Because the more you bring out, the more you need to go, the more topology you bring out, the more you need to go in and just double check that all that stuff you've been adding isn't extended from an incorrect base. So you're constantly trying to balance out how much detail you put in how much new detail you put in compared to how much cleaning you do on the topology you've already got. See, I'm just going in and trying to redistribute these a little bit. And as usual, see this pinch on the outside here. Once I go in and add some beveling, just like we've got on the edge here, it'll be much easier to determine how much further in that point needs to go. But when you do have an area like that, what I can do is I can select it, and then from the opposite side, I've shown you this in previous lessons, go in and as I'm pulling this, take note of what's happening down here, because that tells me what axis I need to push that vertex in on, and I can just hold X and pull that in until that pinching disappears. Okay, now I'm going to grab all these vertices down the bottom, and I'm just going to drag them down. And actually what I can do is I can drag them down once and then twice, and then select the edge ring in between and delete it. And this is going to cause a base mesh for us to work with when putting in the chin area. I'm going to leave this. I'll explain a little bit later when I go in and start adding some detail to this area, but it's probably one of the trickiest points of the surface that we're going to work with in this lesson, because you've got an area that's kind of rounded out this way, you know, and we can't see that yet because we don't have the edge loop in the center, but then you've got these two hard points. So it's going to require going in and adding a little bit of a weird topology, and I'll potentially, if I get time, show you how to do it a couple of different ways. So you notice as I drag that up, because the curvature once again starts flowing in this direction as well, backwards, I rotate all the geometry together, and what that does is it's going to keep the curvature we had lined up here flowing back vertically. So I can just go in and delete these two edges, and now what I can do is I'm actually going to remove this inside loop, select all these together, scale them down, and just move them into place. And now you can see that the way the design works in terms of how this curve flows into the, you know, the roundness on the edges, we don't need to do any real editing. We just need to make sure that the scale is right, and that's what's going to help create that nice, smooth, rounded faceplate. Just move these up into position. And don't worry about this pinching that's happening here, because once again, I can fix that in the exact same way as I fixed this faceplate, where you can see this kind of T-junction happens just by simply going in and chamfering this a little bit later. Then the topology will flow around. I mean, obviously we need to have a couple of edge loops rounding it off this way first, but that will fix that situation. Just going to go in and chamfer this top piece. And you can see what's happening here is we get a little bit of a wobble in the surface. So I can fix that just by, even though I'm moving the vertices on the left here, and as usual, I'm just repeating some of the same techniques I've explained throughout the course. I'm looking at the opposite side while doing this because it's critically important to make sure that that curve does flow up nice and evenly. So as I make those adjustments, I can start pulling some vertices down. Just going to grab all these together. Just realized that that point kind of doesn't actually stick out as far as I thought. So I'm just going in and just kind of re-rounding off the surface. So what's happening here is because we've got the symmetry setting on the inside, the threshold's a little bit too high. We're getting these two vertices pinching. So I'm just going to drop that down until that dissipates. And now I can go back to, shaping that. Just connected those 2 extra points, and now we've got a little bit more of a similar distribution of polygons that we have on the bottom faceplate. And throughout the whole model, I'm going to constantly try and keep the polygons, where possible at least. There's obviously going to be areas that require little bits of detail, but on the flat and smooth parts, I'll try and keep the polygons roughly this size. And on personal models, sometimes that's not always necessary, but when you're trying to do something a little bit more professional, like an Iron Man model, it helps with the UV distribution when you're unwrapping the mesh, and it also makes sure that kind of no matter where you're at, if you have to go in and add detail, you've kind of gotten used to the curves flowing over the mesh and how to edit this level of polygons. So if you start all of a sudden going twice as detailed as this, the workload for optimizing that area becomes a lot more, or in general, things just become a lot more difficult. And if you go lower resolution than this, you might not have enough detail to actually go in and add those finer details later on in the process. So whatever's working for this main faceplate, I'm just going to try and continue that up through the surface itself. See, once again, I'm just trying to keep things, these edges that are coming out this way, all just happening evenly. You can see here it just goes down, then kind of pops up and down again. So the little things like that are actually going to make all the difference in terms of how clean your mesh looks. I'll go from above. You can see little problems like that just start popping up. So I'm not really happy with this surface yet, but it's better than it was when I started out. But I'm just going to kind of adjust a couple more vertices, and then I'll get on to adding these stuff up here. At this point I can go in, now that I've got all the polygons kind of distributed this way in a square kind of fashion, I can go in and do the same thing I did to this point here. I'm just going to do something a little bit different this time. Rather than just welding a point to here and causing a little bit of a pinch, what you can do is you can go in and chamfer this point here and target weld like so, and that's going to leave us with the polygons necessary to create a nice pinch-free area. It's just going to require a little bit of editing to make that happen. So I'm going to pull this in like so. And you can see we've got that pinch there. I just need to go from side on, make a couple of adjustments, because the goal here is to get this happening perfectly flat, or as flat as possible anyway. You know. And as I pull this in, you'll notice that pinch start to disappear, even though we've got a 5-sided polygon in that area. I can actually further reduce the effect of that just by pulling it around like so. And you know, once again, just because that's a 5-sided polygon doesn't mean that it's, you know, bad topology, because if I go in and turn off the isoline display and go back to one iteration, now you can see what's actually happening and how the mesh is smoothing. So from above, you can see what's happening is we're not getting the roundness, kind of, it all fails here. You know, here we've got some nice stuff happening, but then it all starts to go to shit a bit up here. So I can just pull this down. I'm just constantly looking for little bits that just look a bit out of whack. Let's see here, for example. So even though that's a little bit too wobbly for my own liking, you know, I'm just going to try and block out this whole faceplate in this lesson so that we've got something to work on. And right at the end, I'll go in and do my final tweaking to get all of this kind of flowing nicely. But for now, you can see how the topology is nice and even throughout the surface. You know, there's a couple of little things we can do, like going in and adding in an edge loop on here, on the inside. So I can go in. I'm going to not add it down the bottom here. And now I can go in and connect it to this point. I'm going to connect an edge loop along the side here and just target weld that. And now you can see that connects like so. Now to keep this flowing evenly, I can add in another edge loop down the bottom here. And there you go, perfect topology. Actually just going to leave that and pull these down. This is not fully necessary. And you can see that removes that pinching that we were getting there. So now we're going to create the edge loops to kind of flow up through here. So I'm going to, for this area, I'm going to once again use the scale tool, pull it down, go straight to the side. What I can do is I can rotate that. You can see it's a little bit more flat, so I'm going to use the scale tool on that area. I'm not completely sure this area is correct. You can see it's a little bit more tricky to get happening. I'm going to grab these points, pull them in. And then pull down. Now I know that these are going to have to line up exactly here. So now you can see that this area, if I pull this in, it needs to be completely flat. So the topology is going to need to flow around this way and around this way. So we've got some hard edge there and a hard edge here. So to do this, I'm going to grab these vertices, or these edges, sorry, chamfer it, just like so. I'm going to grab these ones, unselect here, and unselect here. And chamfer this way. Now, because I don't have a perfect solution for this area yet, I'm just going to do something that's kind of potentially going to work, but it might require some more fine tuning on this outside part. So you can see what I've done here is we've got this weird shape. I can connect up between those two, resulting in a triangle. But if I slide that point down and go in and connect along here, you'll notice that it gives me the option connecting these two points, removing this one, and then we end up with a nice clean topology where it's flowing both directions. It's symmetrical, and the mesh isn't as dirty as it was. So you can see now I'm just I'm just going to undo that and just kind of explain what I'm trying to do here. you'll notice this point kind of is going in a little bit too far. It's not flowing evenly along this curve that's running up here. So I'm just correcting that. And as I move this out, you'll notice now that that topology flows a little bit more evenly, but it's going to require going in and cleaning up this kind of roundness. So it can get a little bit tedious, you know what I mean? But if you just constantly go in, make those small adjustments, you will maintain the smoothness on your surface. So one of the things that's been bugging me now is taking a look at this pinch in the eye area here. So I'm going to go in and add a chamfer to this part. I'm just going to do it like so, and I'm going to keep that same setting so that it's always even. You'll notice that when I add edges at the start of the process, I don't go in and add too much hardness. I try and keep things a little bit versatile, because if I really need to go in and make this like kind of laser sharp, I can just simply go in and add a connection into that area, and you can see what that does is it just goes from being, perfectly rounded to perfectly sharp. But it's something I save right until the end of the process. I'm going to go in and add a connect up here and then slide this up. It's another little trick I've got, and if you'll notice the little pinch that's happening here, I can get rid of that once again with some careful placement. I just need to make sure that from above the mesh is smoothing evenly, and it pulls in just a little bit, and then that goes away. Not completely though, I will go in at some point and just kind of refine those edges a little bit more, and you can see I can select this and pull these in just at that tiny little bit, so you can see we've gone from having zero difference there to just slightly inwards. And what that does is the way that the tessellation works, it's going to pull that geometry in. So with the ice line off, we weren't getting that slight curve. It was perfectly flat. But I just want to make sure that, it's pulling in just that little bit. It's going to help us catch some highlights on that surface. Going to chamfer this up the top here. I'm going to pull this whole kind of point in. I can unselect the inner areas and then pull this in like so. And that's going to give me that bevel along the eye line. It's quite an important area, so I want to make sure that I've got the thickness of this bevel correct. So I've actually got up a reference to the right here from a movie poster, and when we go in and do the lighting lesson, I'm going to try and create an action scene like this. We're only going to have the bus. What I mean is I'm going to try and create some lighting to simulate that kind of movie poster look. Just pull this in just a little bit. So there's actually some smaller details where this eye socket kind of comes in underneath. I'm not going to get to that in this lesson because I just want to block out as much as possible on the head, but it will be a cool little area to show you how to go in and add some finer detail. Basically what happens on the mesh is, there's a little area where this eye socket kind of clicks into place and it goes like this, and then this part slots into that area. can still see there's a little bit of pinching there. I'm just going to save that because I'm not sure exactly, if I've got the beveling correct. I'll just wait until I've blocked a little bit more out. So I'm going to pull the chin out now. So I'm going to drag once, and then twice, and then delete this point in here. I'm just going to go in and select this, duplicate this kind of gold shader I've got, and make it red. Doesn't matter what the name is of the shader. Now you can see there's a little inset up on the chin area that didn't make it into the final film model. But then on the chin also there's an area here where it kind of rounds downwards. So I'm just going to select these points, move them down first like so. And then make sure it's all even. Just going to drag the chin up. And actually, while I do that, I'll just drag out from both points. I'm just going to drag this up here. There's going to be a little bit of work we need to do in this area. And it can be a little bit annoying when you're dragging out edge loops because it's keeping because of the object ID, it's assigning the gold material. So I can just reassign that. And what I need to do is we're going to cut an edge loop along here. Like so. Just going to connect these and delete this point. And now I've got, the faceplate area separate from the chin. Just going to move that out like so. Just trying to align it to the edge of the blueprint. And this area actually rounds out a little bit. There's a line that it's hard to spot here, but it actually kind of flows along the mask edge right here. So just bring in the reference image, you'll see here. This line here. Scaled all those in. Just going to connect, sorry, I'm just going to bridge these 2 points. And this point here. So what I'm doing here is I'm redirecting the edge loop from underneath, and I'm going to swing that up here. So we end up with something like that for now. Select this edge here and chamfer it. And then weld these two to cap that point. So because there's some very subtle roundness on this plate here, and I'll show you what that's going to do is when it's perfectly flat like this, you don't get as much highlight, but as you pull that out, you'll notice you get the highlight kind of spreading this way. So it's very subtle, but even just having a tiny bit there, when you have a highlight hitting that area, it's going to, you know, blend over it a lot more easy. Connect that area up, and I'm just slowly building the area so it has enough topology to go in and add some of these curves. What I'm doing here is I'm just trying to make this edge just kind of snake out and flow as evenly as it can. I'm pulling this edge in, and I'm going to weld this down here like so. That's going to terminate it, but now I need to go in and make sure that it's got enough geometry to kind of wrap around and create the hard edge I want. So what I can do to do that is I can come in, connect around the point like so, come back up. Now we've got two edges defining that area, and if I do a nice little cool trick here and go in and remove that edge loop, what I can do is I can go from side on, pull this out, and that's going to produce that perfect point there. And all I need to do to get rid of the pinching is just make sure that it's, you know, coming out like so. So I'm going to keep a little topological flow happening down here, because what I've noticed is the gold plated metal also has a slight curve on it. So I'm going to go in and chamfer these 2 points. And now what I can do is kind of pull this in just that little bit. Connect an edge there, chamfer the base of it, I can pull this up, like so. And this is actually meant to be a hard edge itself. So I'm just going to kind of have a quick play. I'm going to pull this in like so. Remove this edge loop. I don't usually like when things like this happen, but all I'm doing is just kind of playing with redistributing the edge loops in the hope that eventually I come across kind of a pattern that removes the pinching on these areas while giving me the ability to harden them off. It comes like that. I'm definitely going to go in down here, add another edge loop. I'm just going to flow connect this and pull these points out. And now when I do that, I'm also going to need to go in up here and pull these out just slightly. That looks a little bit better, but now we've got this area here, and hopefully I can get away with the 5-sided point. So I can go in here. You can see earlier on I added those two. I chamfered the edge loop on the inside here, and now I'm just going to do that to this point. And when I do that, I've done it so that it lines up down the bottom. Now with edge constraint turned on, I'm just going to go in and slide these up, and once again make these polygons distributed as evenly as possible. And when you add little areas like this, the more square the polygons are surrounding those areas, the better chance you have of removing the pinching that's going on. You'll notice that now that I've added those extra polygons in that area, I've got a little bit more control over how round that area needs to be, and I'm very confident that I can completely get rid of those problems. So you can see bit by bit, I'm just cleaning up those areas. And there's probably going to need to be a little bit more of a curve on the inside here, so I can just go into that area and pull it down like so. And if I really need to, I can slide this across, because what I've done is I've turned edge constraint on. I don't want to lose, if I turn that off and pull it out, you'll see we lose the roundness down here. So it's easier if I turn edge constraint on, then unselect those two base meshes, those two vertices, turn off the constraint toggle, and now pull that down. I'm just going to make a few more refinements to the main faceplate, and then I'm going to drag out some edges to start rebuilding the back of the head. Now there's obviously some problems still with this faceplate, but I feel like I've got enough of a topological base set up now where everything's nice and clean, where I can start adding in some other shapes and then go back to fixing some other small areas that might need some tune-ups. One of the problems I'm seeing here is that the spacing between these vertices and back here is kind of off. So to fix that, I'm just going to drag these down and pull these ones up. So I'm going to scale them, move them back. All of these vertices I can pull up a little bit. I'm going to bring them forward slightly. And bringing them forward like that is just going to give it some more, a very subtle kind of bulge outwards that wasn't there before. One of the problems I'm seeing here is that the spacing between the plate on the top of the head and the bottom of the chin isn't really lining up anymore. So to fix that, I'm just going to quickly go in, look at the front, kind of gauge what could potentially be going wrong here. And I can see that this vertex isn't really pulled out enough. I've got to pull the face down a little bit to shrink that gap we're seeing here, and then potentially pull this out a bit more. Now from side on, I'm going to need to pull this forward. And what that's done is you can see it's fixed that problem that was happening before where it was kind of spread out like that. And now that kind of spacing becomes a lot more even. Just going to go up the top here, pull this down. Pull it a little bit further in, and then I'm going to chamfer this edge off. It's starting to look fairly clean. You can see maybe a little bit of a warp here. I'm just going to go from above and check out what could be causing that. So even just very little subtle things like this, you know, that's going to dramatically affect how curvy this whole front, you know, is going to turn out. So actually I'm just going to scale this. So looking fairly clean. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag out these vertices like so. And actually, I'm going to drag out once, you know, making a very small gap here, and then out again, and just the same as we've been doing, delete that spacing. I'm going to go into my material editor and apply the shader to this. And if I just bring the reference, you can see here that this point is kind of going into a sharp, you know, like a sharp little point. So to get that, I've got to merge these vertices up. But then I've also got to start to consider how I'm going to redistribute the edge flow, because now we've got this perfectly circle earpiece on the side of the head. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to merge the vertices up, and I'm going to try a couple of different things first. You know, I could technically just target weld these in, but what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and grab these two vertices here, scale them, then pull them up so that I'm not actually removing that detail, and that will give me the option to have things rounding as hard as I want or as soft as I want. So I'm just going to pull these out. I'm going to pull them really close. And you can see, because I haven't actually changed the directionality of those loops, we get a nice kind of soft transition. Now you can see my head's kind of not as wide as it should be here. So to get things perfectly matching, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put an FFD modifier on, and I'm going to make it a 3x3. Now I can select the whole side of the head and kind of move it out like so, without distorting or ruining the geometry itself. So it's very important at different times to make sure that you are sticking to the correct proportions, because if I had the head a little bit wide, a little bit thinner, for example, you can see it looks wrong. You know, it's got to be spot on to the blueprints, as close as you can. And I know with blueprints this low res, you're going to struggle to match, you know, little tiny edges, but the overall proportions, you want to make sure you're doing your best to get all that stuff fitting. So since I've done that, I can just collapse that down and just get straight back to modeling. So now here, I'm going to go in, I'm going to delete all the edge loops up the top here. Even though there's a line kind of running through the side of the head, you know, running up along here, I'm not going to worry about that for the moment, because it's a perfectly flat shape. And what I can do later is, once I've got the topology how I want, kind of flowing up around the back of the head, I can go in and recut that. So I'm going to delete that. And now I'm also going to select the topology. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because I'm just trying to figure out how I want this all to kind of sit together. So what I'll do is I'll drag this up. Kind of line it up. I'm going to keep this coming out. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag up some edge loops to create this round earpiece. Later on, I'll show you how I'll get this perfectly cylindrical using the script I showed you in the first lesson, the regularized script. But once again, I'm creating enough edges as I drag out here to kind of match the same level of detail we've got everywhere else on the mesh. Now technically what I can do is I can select these 2 points and bridge them. And now when I move the geometry like so, you know, it's not as pretty as I want it though. Something that might be a better option is going in and connecting like this, target welding here, then deleting this part. from the head here, I'm going to unselect these vertices, make sure I've only got these top ones selected. And just before I do this, because it's quite important to keep that consistency flowing over the top of the head, I'm going to take one more look and see if the shape I've got set up here is perfectly correct. And what I can kind of see is it's not going down far enough. So I can select these vertices, use the soft selection, and start to make some, small adjustments. If I change the pinch, what you'll see happen is I get more of a curve when I pull things. So I can use that to assist bringing in the edges. You see before this is meant to be perfectly straight, yet it kind of fades out. So I'm going to use the tool, the soft selection tool, to kind of pull those points back in. And now what's happened is up the top here we get a little bit more of a rounded curvy surface. But it's not perfect, it could probably be a little bit more round this way. So I'm just going to go from underneath here and just double check that. Select these 2 points, and this time I can change the way that curve is rotating. And then up the top here, I'm going to select this, and just very subtle things like this can make all the difference. So I'm just going to pull that up. And now what you'll see will happen is we get a kind of roundness that wasn't there before. And you'll notice little things like that, it's giving it that softness which kind of emulates what's going to happen in real life. A lot of the times CG modelers have a bad habit of making edges way too hard. And it's little tiny highlights like that that are going to bring out the shape and detail on the mesh. If everything's perfectly kind of milled and there's no imperfections or there's no softness to any of the shapes, you lose a lot of that realism that you get when you take a look at some of the things like Sideshow Toys has produced. So for example, if you take a look at this reference image here, you can see the edges are quite soft. There's parts that don't exactly fit, but overall, the edges still, you're getting little highlights here. Around the back here, you can just tell it's a little bit soft. There's some areas where it's not perfectly in line. There's areas where it kind of goes underneath a little bit. But the point is that every single one of these edges, in some way, shape, or form, is capable of picking up a highlight because it's not, a 90-degree edge. So even where the inside of the mask joins, we're catching a highlight. And when I show you in the mastering lighting lesson in Octane, that's going to play a crucial role in how you light things, because it's little details like that when your model is done correctly really give you that chance of creating something truly photoreal. So I'm just having a play here with kind of how to, let me just to make things easier for you guys to see what's going on. I'm just kind of trying to redistribute and change the directionality of the topology in this area to kind of be a little bit more even, so that we've got some polygons, square polygons to work with. Now I'm just starting to space things out now that I've got the topology flowing a little bit nicer. So I'm just going to try and reduce the amount of vertices that are going to make up this outside cylinder. So to do that, I'm just going to start kind of pushing in some edges. And when you get to tricky areas like this where you got to rethink how you want to distribute the edge loops, sometimes it takes, just sitting there for a little minute in your head trying to visualize how things are best going to kind of keep flowing. So right now I'm just trying to figure out what's the easiest way I can reduce the amount of polygons here while still keeping all the shape and the topology flowing in the correct direction. So now making that change, I've got the option of sliding these vertices down. Start to even this out a little bit more. I'm probably going to have to go in and add some edge loops this way. And I don't usually like not having the same amount of vertices kind of lining up each direction. But sometimes it's a necessary evil. But what it will do is it will mean that the kind of seam you're seeing along here isn't going to line up exactly the same. But that can still potentially be fixed later on. So you can see we've got quite a few vertices to work with here. Just going to make sure that, from the side they're roughly kind of bulging out just a little bit. I don't want it to be perfectly flat. I do want that area to pick up some kind of soft highlights. It's not too bad. Obviously, I'm going to need to go in and, you know, take a closer look at this once I start adding some seams. I'm just trying to take a look at this point at the overall proportions. You know, from front on now, the head's kind of lining up. We're missing some detail at the back here in terms of how it bulges out. So you can see what the cause of that is that these are actually physically going in. So little adjustments like this. Every time you drag out a new area on the mesh, you're just going to have to go in and just run through this same process of, you know, tidying up and reevaluating how all the topology starts to sit together. So from here, what I can do is I can do what I was actually originally going to plan on doing. I was going to try and drag this out first and then join this into it. But you know what? It doesn't really matter the direction, the order in which you do it. So same old. I've dragged out 2, and then I can delete this last point. And I do apologize that as the lesson goes on, you know, I talk a little bit less, but I figure once I kind of get on a roll, you're kind of watching less on me, you know, you're watching less for me to explain every little detail and more for me just to see how I tackle different areas of the mesh. When I start the next part of the lesson, I'll go back, you know, as the lesson as the lesson starts, I'll explain things in more detail and then kind of get into a bit of a groove and settle in as the lesson continues. You know, because after the couple of hour mark, it gets a lot harder for me to focus on the technical side because I also need to just kind of get this out in a timely manner, you know what I mean? I don't want to show you guys what this stuff looks like at its absolute slowest. It's sometimes good to see someone working a little bit faster, but as a result of that, it means I have to talk a bit less. And obviously, I'm still not working at 100% speed. If I was doing that, it would be a slightly different workflow. But as you're teaching people, you need to make sure you're not doing anything stupid, because one of the things I didn't used to do as a modeler was post whips that had any, you know, buggy problems. So I try and avoid those as I'm modeling. So I actually wouldn't post this as a whip because I know there'd be little problems like this. So for me to actually be happy to post an early whip on this project, I'd actually go in and clean up all those little things, call that certain area finished, and then start adding more detail elsewhere. And I recommend you guys to do the same. You know, if you get into the habit of not accepting anything except perfection, at least even if the mesh isn't finished, you still look like no matter what you do, you're not capable of creating messy objects. And that's simply not true. It's just you need to kind of hide it from people. And as a result of that, people gain a little bit more respect for your attention to detail, and being a bit of a perfectionist always looks better than someone posting stuff which has glaring problems like this. Now we can get a kind of rough feel for how these edges kind of fade out here, and you have to imagine that as this V kind of tapers out towards the back, it's going to start curving in again. So I'm going to select these 2 points and pull those in. Actually, before I do that, I'm just going to grab these ones and use edge constraint toggle so I'm not damaging the mesh too much. Now select these, turn off edge constraint, and start pulling them in. You know, we've lost the shape on this mesh, so I'm going to have to go in and just kind of manually start to replay with it. I'm just trying to flatten out this here because there's a bit too much of a rounded kind of softness to this area. So to do that, I'm going to go from an angle where I can see how flat it is and just pull it in. And once again, I haven't done it so it's perfectly flat. There's still going to catch a little bit of highlights in there when I go to render this. And now you can see that's looking a lot better. Just going to drag this down. using the continuation from here. You can actually see, let me bring up a reference image for you. That's funny, I actually struggled to find some high-res reference from the side here. But I'll just bring the reference I've been using. You can see there's a slight tiny little bevel that kind of fades up into the pinch there. So in order to do that, I've just got to make some little changes here. One of those is bringing this vertex up so that when that bevel does go in, when that chamfer that's going in does go in, it does go into the right point. And that's just going to mean redistributing some of those vertices. So just flattening this area out. I'm trying to pull this inner cheek so it's further in. I think it's sticking out just a little bit too much at the moment. You can see as I drag this across, it doesn't have this kind of bulge outwards like mine does. So what I'm doing is I'm just going in and flattening this area off. And as I do that, I'm just going from the front to double check and flatten off the second row as well. Now we've got a bit more of a straight line happening here. It doesn't come in and then bulge out. You can see from the perspective view now, doing those changes has been quite messy. So from underneath at this extreme view, I can just go in and without kind of selecting anywhere, I've already selected, once you move, and I've taught you this before, once you move it on that axis, if you just click the vertex, next time you touch it, you should be able to, sorry, I'm just on screen mode, you should be able to just pull it in that direction. So just getting everything bit by bit. I'm going to grab this border now and apply a chamfer to this. And this is actually a very hard edge compared to some of the other ones in the model. So I'm going to make this a little bit wider, and it's going to give me the option to potentially later on add another one right on the inside here. But also doing this gives me the opportunity up here to create an edge like so, and now that's flowing around. While still not creating any pinching up here. And now if I really want to, I can go in and connect using the Flow Connect and just join these up. You can see the subtle little dip in there, produces that wonky shape. So all those little borders you've got, just lift them out. And we're slowly getting there, bit by bit. So I'm just going to tidy up this side panel here. So you can see if I bring in my reference, what we're going to do is we're just going to create this piece now. And the blueprints are quite low res here. So what I do is I just kind of wing it, do it based on kind of my gut instinct, and then I'll start adjusting things based on the perspective view. So you can see I pulled that up. I'm going to delete this inside bit and weld this. I'm going to connect 2 loops along here and just target weld like so. I'm just going to pull these out and get them lined up. So I'm just pausing, taking a look at it, seeing if there's anything I need to kind of add. And one of those things is going to be getting some hardness down here, as well as getting some beveling running along this side face. So I'm just going to connect with one edge loop up till here. I'm going to grab all these polygons and pull them out. And I'm just going to chamfer this area here. You can see we've started to add a little bit of shape in that, while the topology is still flowing down and connecting nicely. It's probably tucking under a bit too much, so I'm just going to pull this out. You can see by connecting there, I keep a four-sided polygon while still giving myself the option of hardening off this area. Now I can just pull this out a little bit while keeping this all even, yet kind of enhancing this bevel. Now you notice I'm going to go in and chamfer this edge so we've got some hardness everywhere. Now just remember, when you do that, there's always just going to be some areas where the topology doesn't flow exactly how you want. So you'll see me quickly just kind of, as I select these edges, I'm taking note of the areas that kind of fork off and branch off, because when I do, I'm going to need to go in, and the easiest way to unselect those is to select it where it forks off, then come out and unselect from those points, because you can see I can now drag out. So also it's important to realize when you do chamfer those areas, they are going to cause little problems. So that's why I'll just select the two and just weld them back together. You see very slowly, just kind of over time, as I tweak, as I move vertices into position, things start to line up a lot easier. See, it's very easy to fix that pinching. I'm just going to go in on the other side. As usual, I move it once, check on the axis that it's on, and I'm just going to push that in until it disappears. Just going to pull the chin under now. And you can actually see this is where I need to just take another quick look, because in the blueprint the chin basically goes perfectly flat underneath here. So I'm just going to connect and slide up, and this gives me the option to weld this part together. And I can kind of see what needs to be done here. I need to go in and add another edge loop on the inside just to make sure that that remains hard. Like so. Or if I don't want to go in and add that detail there, I can kind of mix it up a bit, add it underneath here, and I'm just going to connect once, go on the inside here. Going to connect this together, merge that down, connect here, and get rid of these vertices. So I'm not exactly sure how this area is going to be working. You know, you can see there's some small problems with it. So I'm just going to leave it for now. I think the best thing to do for a piece like this is to probably add some edge loops on the inside here. But because I'm not exactly sure of how the chin works yet, I've got to take a second look at it. I'll just wait and play with that a little bit later. Okay, so you can see so far for the first lesson, I don't want to go too far and bore you. I'm starting to get a little bit, it's starting to get a little bit difficult for me to break down everything I'm doing. So we'll continue on the head in the next lesson, try and finish that off. If there's any small details remaining, in the last lesson we'll get on to the shoulder area. You've got these kind of, I don't know if they're jet packs, but the area around the neck, we'll start building that. And then if there's time in the final lesson, I'll go in and show you how to add in the smaller details. Thanks heaps guys for patiently waiting for this lesson to get started. I've had tons of fun doing it and I think it's going to turn out really awesome. As you saw at the start of the lesson, we're going to be utilizing Octane to render the scene, and I've invested a lot of time into creating those really nice procedural shaders and setting up that scene so that you guys, as you're modeling, can chuck it in there and see how things are going. Octane's an extremely powerful tool, and probably it's one of the most exciting things I've been waiting to teach. And in the lighting course, in the third lesson, which is going to be released around the time I finish the third or fourth hard surface lesson, we'll be able to go in, utilize the model built from this lesson, chuck it into that scene, and I'll show you guys how to construct those shaders in Octane. And because the hard surface guys waited so long for this lesson to be released, you guys will get that mastering lighting lesson for free. So that'll be in your video tutorial area, and hopefully you guys get something out of that. I'd seriously recommend investing in Octane as a render engine if you're a modeler, because even just for things like turntables, as I'm going to show you later in the lighting course, it can really accentuate just how awesome some models are when they do look photoreal. Thanks heaps dudes, we'll see you in the next part. I've got a fight coming up next Friday, the 29th of May. Actually, the reason why this lesson's a little bit late is I was planning on doing it a week earlier, but my opponent pulled out and my replacement has got 5 victories and 1 loss. So the boxing's getting a little bit exciting now because I'm starting to fight guys with a little bit more serious records. The guy after this, in 3 weeks' time, he's got a record of 6 wins and 0 losses. So I'm looking forward to taking that from him. Hope you guys liked the lesson. I'm glad we're finally back working on the hard surface course. If you've got any questions, I'm up to date with emails now, so don't hesitate to send those through. I've tried since the last kind of month to make a really big push to get the business back on track, because I was training so much that I just physically, some days, even though I've got the spare time, you're just so worn down from training, because at this point, I'm basically training like a professional. The only thing I'm not doing is taking steroids, and all that would do at this point is just allow me to train that extra day. And obviously for ethical reasons, I wouldn't do that. My point is that if I train any more than I have been, then the business kind of suffers, and I've got to balance out both of those things. So it's taken me a while to realize that, and it's taken me a while to find a little bit of a balance in my life and try and understand what I'm capable of physically, because once I set my mind to something, I kind of do whatever it takes to succeed at it. So once again guys, thanks heaps for your patience. I really appreciate it. I know some of you guys thought the hard surface course was kind of finishing up right now, but in reality we've still got lots of content to go. Cheers dudes, I'll see you next time.